Melody, would you sort of give a background for what Legacy Global is so that we can sort of frame where you're at? And then I'm going to ask some directed questions after I introduce Rick that sort of will set the base for the conversation.
Yeah, I'm Melodie Durfee. I head up a group called Legacy Global, and it's a group of both philanthropic and social impact organizations. One of our primary offerings is we are a DAF administrator. So we're very involved in the donor advised fund and foundation space. Part of what I specialize in is in the impact investing space and in the alternative assets. Most of the assets on my platform are invested in these other vehicles. They're not in the public market. And a large part of what I do is work with other foundations in terms of liberating capital that are in those mutual fund offerings in a way that can be invested in companies that are actively working on the problems that these foundations are trying to grant funds out to solve.
Okay, thank you. And Rick, with your advisory company, can you sort of frame that company for us?
Yeah, we're an impact investing advisory firm. We're not an RIA or a wealth manager or asset manager. We actually consult to RIAs and wealth managers in addition to investors and donors themselves. But we are focused on private sector impact investing. So we're not shilling ESG mutual funds or anything in that vein. We're helping parties contemplate what their strategy should be as it relates to that part of the portfolio that's going into private equity or venture capital or whatever it may be, projects, and how they direct that towards things that are both financially rewarding as well as socially or environmentally impactful. And in that vein is how we have started to provide strategic guidance around the use of donor advised funds as for-profit impact investing tools.
And so we have these two worlds. We're using words from two worlds here of the nonprofit world where I have some money that I donated away and I'm creating a fund as a way of doing that donation to something I still have control over at some level. And we're using this venture capital, private company, for-profit company model, and we're mixing the words together. So I want to make sure we define things a little bit tightly. So when we say a donor advised fund, what are we meaning by that? What is the thing that does? And specifically, Melody, I wonder if you could distinguish this donor advised fund thingy from this program fund thingy that you have.
Yeah, so I do a lot of different types of charitable accounts, and to establish some of what those are, with the donor advised fund, there's very specific IRS regulation that works with what we can and can't do with those. But I like to think of it as similar to how if you're going out to do some banking business, it's rather expensive and complicated and time consuming to set up your own bank. So you go to an existing bank and take out an account and they handle all the compliance. So part of what I do, or Fidelity or Vanguard or a donor advised fund sponsor, is we're that umbrella banking organization that offers these accounts. So with a donor advised fund, somebody can set up an account, that they can advise the account. So they have the legal right to give advice regarding investments, regarding donations, and it can support any public US charity. Now, if you're dealing with foreign charitable activities, we're going to need to have a bridging fund or account. That's a large part of what my group does. We deal with a lot of multinational families or companies, because donor advised funds, they're fantastic tools, but again, they're best used for their statutory purpose, which is granting money out to US public charities. And even with granting money out, though, they can invest. The investment options are much wider. The issues with investing capital in a donor advised fund come down to what the donor advised fund sponsor permits. So Fidelity and Schwab and Vanguard are really good examples of the three biggest players in the donor advised fund marketplace. And where they make money on is they make money by having those funds invested on their platforms. So you're not going to be able to do a lot of, if any, VC investing there. They have started to open up to alternatives, but that's only open for very large accounts. and it's a very limited group of offerings. So groups like mine are some of the few, I believe there's only 3 that I'm aware of that currently actively do alternative investing in the US. And most of those, again, are focused on the larger groups. Part of what my group focuses on is not just large accounts, but small accounts as well. And we do a lot of crowdfunding with that. One other type of account mentioned, though, is something my group does is we have a type of account that we call a program fund. That's not a legal term, but what we found is there's a lot of interest from people trying to use donor advised funds for things that they're not legally structured for, such as giving to a qualified overseas charity or investing in a company that the donor or client is also personally invested in. And so with that, we've come up on my platform with this hybrid fund type where it's similar to a donor advised fund. The paperwork's really easy. You set it up, you can name it whatever you want, but it's not legally a donor advised fund. And what that means is there's no legal right to advise, but because there's no legal right to advise, we can do a lot more with it. It's very, very flexible. And even though there's no legal right to advise, we can still have advisory committees made up of the donors or the people who founded this. We just don't have to legally listen to them. Now, I will tell you, the second I stop listening to those sending me funding for their reasonable requests, I'm going to go out of business pretty soon. There's just some legal nuances. But with these program funds, for example, we do a lot of investing. We often white label them. So we'll be working with a corporation or a for-profit entity that's doing fundraising for a specific cause. And then we can funnel the funds, and then the funds can be invested in that line. So the program funds we use a lot more often on the investing end, even though we can still invest the same way on the donor advised funds.
Right. Thank you very much. So Rick, I would sort of like to take the example that Devin gave us and sort of chew at it a little bit and see if the chewing at that takes us back to Melodie. So as I understand what Devin said, he has some money that he wanted to donate. He donated it into a DAF and set up a DAF. He forgot about it. It's sitting there invested in something, probably in stocks or mutual funds, because that's sort of the default. And it's just sitting there, perhaps growing, perhaps not, getting no attention. And so you wrote this article that I referenced in the thing about how to do this. And you said something about a vast majority of the DAFs were starting to get into that state where they're not getting the attention they need and they're just sitting there accumulating. Do you want to sort of lay a perspective for us around that?
Sure. Yeah, no, the reality is donor advised funds were set up with the best of intention as a structure to help make a quicker and easier path to donated capital or social enterprise endeavors. But the reality is they're very apt to become sort of set it and forget it. So he is definitely not alone in the situation of setting up a DAF, because either you did it on your own account, or your tax advisor or your wealth advisor said, hey, look, it's tax season. One quick way to deal with an offset is to set up a donor advised fund. Let's take some funds. And I know you care about whatever that thing is, animal welfare, social justice, whatever it may be. But we'll figure out later how to allocate those funds. We don't have to worry with that now, because the donor advised fund structure makes that very simple. Let's just set up the donor advised fund. The problem occurs is it's not just the set it, it's the forget it part. So he's very much not alone. The reality is we now have donor advised funds skyrocketing in use. We have almost $200 billion now tucked away in donor advised funds. But less than 20% of that money actually makes it back out the door to do its stated purpose. And when you're investing in something, and I note this in the article you're referencing, you're investing with a group like Fidelity, there's an inherent conflict that exists there for the Fidelities and the Schwabs and the Vanguards of the world, because they're not only investing that money, they're investing that money in themselves, their own mutual funds, their own. And so ideally they are doing well. Those funds are increasing in value, but the underlying purpose of having the money come back out the door to do something meaningful could be lost. And so it's not that Fidelity Charitable and other groups like that don't provide things that you can donate into, but they certainly have, let's say, a motivation, not necessarily to encourage that. So organizations, DAF sponsors like Legacy that Melodie runs, have a different mindset. They're not running their own funds. They're not trying to keep that money in order to maintain that, that ongoing opportunity to invest in their own product line. And so we're very big about encouraging parties to identify donor-run sponsors that enable the kinds of things you want to do with those donated funds. But regardless of whether that sponsor, does or not, certainly advocate getting back to wherever your DAF is and getting those funds allocated in some meaningful way. We just happen to be, we're all investors here. This is an angel investor group, very focused as a firm on how to use those funds as investments. Because obviously the underlying benefit of an investment is if it generates returns, those returns come back into the donor advised fund and they're there in the future to invest again in something that you also care about, that next social enterprise or fund or project that aligns with your values. And that is something that's enabled by this.
So you can have a mission from God, donate to that mission from God, get money back and donate again and build a positive, virtuous cycle of doing it over and over and have a compounded interest kind of impact rather than a pay it and pay it and pay it pathway, right? And
absolutely.
That can be a much bigger, significantly larger impact with the money that you donate.
Yeah, I mean, everyone here, I believe, is an investor or involved in some capacity in the investment world. I mean, we're all hoping for big returns. And so, you may have, if you think of a portfolio of investments out of your donor advised fund, you may have it track a similar sort of venture capital fund model where, hey, there's some that don't do well, there's some that just sort of hit solid singles, but every once in a while you're going to have one of those hits a home run. And if you suddenly have millions of dollars come back into your donor advised fund, think about all the benefits and things that you can do with those additional funds. And we've certainly seen examples of those kinds of things happening.
Can I just interject here? From a nonprofit perspective, I think it's doing philanthropy an injustice if we try to make it dependent on continuing donations. It's a much better approach to have money to support the causes and the charities and realize the impact people are going for in a regenerative fashion, which means that instead of having the funds locked up in an investment that isn't helping move that cause along, having them invested in these companies and these products that are making a difference now and can hopefully have a return is a much better approach than just trying to write a bunch of checks and saying, well, I wish I could do that again, but now the money's all spent. And I just see from my side, we often work with these charities, and sometimes when they get these checks, it helps them for 6 months and the money's all gone. And very few charities are set up in order to manage an endowment well. So you can utilize a donor advised fund and have a lot of fun with the investments in a way that protects the long-term ability to support the causes that you care about.
So the classic story is along the lines of what Caitlin was talking about. I take all my money, I put it in an index fund. I want to stop fossil fuels, but the big gains on my index fund came from fossil fuels. And so I'm basically investing in the thing I'm trying to prevent happening by being unaware of the foundation of my investment strategy at the core level, right? And so I have this corpus that is the main corpus, either my personal DAF or in my nonprofit. And then I invest that for something, and then some percentage of that I donate somewhere, right? And there's nothing that prevents me from actually impact investing on mission from the main corpus, whether that's my DAF or whether that's a nonprofit, right? Am I still in the place?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So from what Caitlin said, we need to sort of wake up our philanthropic community to understand that you can be 100% mission aligned with all of your investments, and that can do interesting things. And then the next step in the conversation is it doesn't have to be public stocks. It can actually be unregistered stocks, which is what angel investing is. Angel investing is I take my personal wealth and I invest that in an unregistered stock using some SEC exemption to allow me to do that, whether that's Reg D or whether that's Reg CF. But what the DAF does is the DAF that Melanie has is by definition with Reg D an accredited investor, because you have more than 5 million in assets in total, therefore you're accredited. And so if I, as a non-accredited person, go in to collect a bunch of money into a DAF and I put it into your DAF, you're the one that's doing the investing, not me, because you own it. I don't benefit from it. The fund benefits from it. And I can then engage in angel investing as an exercise, do investment in companies that I think are important. And then when and if they turn into the 100x returns, I then have more money to go invest in those kinds of companies again, right? There's a little bit of magic in there. First of all, we can get away from you have to invest in public stocks. And second of all, I don't have to be accredited to invest in non-public stocks.
Yeah, I would add that it cleans up a cap table, because you don't have, we can, as far as the company goes, it can be one investor as the donor advised fund platform. And on my side, we track whose account is participating in what way. So it makes it a lot easier on the fund managers and the investors, because they're primarily dealing with one investor, even if it's a crowd-funded phase. Nobody on my team manages money, so we're not acting as a legal fund, but we are accredited. The entirety of our financials show up as backing the investments made, which makes it really easy to do these smaller investments with the donors that want to be highly engaged with companies that they care about. And one of the other things is, in the comments before we started, there's a mention of working with foundations who have most of their money publicly invested. One of the ways in which we often work with foundations is they can make a gift, not to a donor advised fund, but to a program fund, and it meets their 5% mandatory distributions every year, so we can meet their minimum goals, but structure it as a repayable grant. So they can make it to my platform. We manage all of the complex investments. When and if we have cash, they can get that back, which is really a win. That's how sometimes we're working with Fidelities or other ones. Now, most of the time, they do want that to be a larger amount. But if it's a smaller foundation, they can do smaller amounts as well. But we can still have the foundation keep the assets on their books, meet their requirements for granting out, and not have to manage the complexity of going into this asset class.
Right.
And,
So
and
go ahead.
I was just going to add that's when they want a recoverable grant. There's
Yes.
also foundations that just don't want to see that money ever again, that they feel like their whole job is to get rid of that 5%. And the last thing they want is for someone to send them back money. I mean, that's an inherent absurdity of the foundation world. We need to get rid of that 5%, which is, part of the reason they avoid PRIs and things of that nature is, oh my gosh, there's going to be a return. Then I have more money I have to deal with to get rid of. Now, there are clearly foundations who are more sophisticated, and recoverable grants make a lot of sense. But for those that don't, who just want to donate that 5% or whatever that amount is, sending it into a DAF or a DAF structure in the vein of what you're describing is one path to very easily deal with that and make sure those funds go into investments with the same benefits that we've been talking about. Returns get generated, then that fund exists for that foundation to advise on where it wants to go in subsequent investments. But it doesn't have to worry with the fact that, now I have money coming back in, and how do I account for that in a world where I'm supposed to be distributing 5% each year?
So does the DAF have a 5% each year or any similar kind of restrictions on it?
No, and that's actually pretty controversial. There are several states working to overturn that. DAFs do not have minimum mandatory distributions. it's part of why I personally want to encourage more DAFs to do investing of this type, because there is a problem if the money's just sitting there not helping people. But I'd rather have it invested than force liquidations, which means that these DAFs can take very long-term approaches to investments. We don't have
Right.
to liquidate a portion to meet a mandatory disbursement.
Right. So I want to take a step back and define some of the terms we're using. You use the word or the acronym PRI. So we have PRIs and we have ESG and we have MRIs. We have impact in investing. Let's sort of define those. What do you mean by a PRI? How is that different than an MRI?
Well, I think the important thing isn't necessarily to distinguish between program-related investments or mission-related investments. Both are tools of the foundation world. Just both of those structures have inherent complications around them. We as an advisory firm help foundations doing these, investing with them, so we're not anti-PRI. We are quick to point out, though, that donor advised funds are so much easier to deal with and provide so much greater flexibility and allow for anonymity and all sorts of other benefits, immediate tax benefits, like all the things you would want to accomplish. Donor advised funds are just easier tools to utilize in that respect. And so once again, we're not anti-philanthropy. I'm not anti program related investments or things of that nature. Donor advised funds just create a mechanism that tends to work quicker and easier without as much of a burden.
Yeah, PRI and MRI are legal terms that have some specific requirements to meet that. I don't think it's helpful to go into that now because as Rick said, it's just so much easier to use a donor advised fund, even if the funds are coming from a foundation, as a vehicle for doing this type of investing, because they don't have those same mandatory rules. With a donor advised fund, it does not have to be structured as a PRI or MRI. Yeah, we do want it to be related to some social good. We want to know what the company's doing to make the planet a better place in some way. But donor advised ones are much more flexible.
Let's dive into that definition. Rick used the word ESG as some hand wave about what we mean by do some good. And we use this notion of impact investing as another hand wave for do some good. But we know that if we asked everybody on the call what they mean by do some good, they would not agree. And so what is it that we need to do in order to be impactful, to do impact investing or do ESG in a way that makes this a possible pathway that's meaningful?
Well, for when I use that term ESG, I used it very much as it's often used in a public markets context. Some sort of filter screen that was applied to determine if that public market investment met certain criteria. And typically, I mean, all we do is work what I would consider beyond that, where things actually are socially or environmentally impactful, that are private sector investments, venture, private equity, lending, whatever it may be. And I don't consider ESG a concept that finds its way into public markets. Private markets, you're not screening in that respect. What you're looking for is something that is fundamentally impactful, that its product or service or business model is enhancing some sort of social or environmental mission. It doesn't have to be the primary mission. It doesn't have to be the sole mission, but there has to be a substantial benefit achieved through that for us to work with that company. But also for a group like Melodie's to be able to release donor advised funds to that entity, meaning there's the inherent due diligence around, is this a good investment that should be a part of any funds going out of a donor advised fund into a social enterprise. But the secondary filter is, does it reach a threshold of this is a social or environmentally impactful endeavor in some respects, which that needs to be a clear component of what they're achieving through their actions or their endeavors. We work as part of our practice, we work with investors, but on the other side of the house, we work with companies and funds and other groups to help them, let's say, extract the social environmental benefits of what they're doing out of their activities and present that in such a way that the legacies of the world can go, okay, I clearly see how you're meeting the criteria that is required of me before I'm allowed to release investments from our donor advised fund.
Yeah, and let me just jump in here. As far as how impact or social progress is defined, there is no standard definition. There are over 30 different impact measurement metric systems that I'm aware of. And so usually what we're going to do is work with every group, every company, every investment, every investor or donor and say, what do you care about? Okay, as you care about, let's go through the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Which ones does that apply to? Okay, can we write a mission statement that says, here's what you're trying to accomplish in the world? And let's add that into the term sheet and then also add in, here's how we're going to measure that. Is it by providing how many students are being funded by the apprenticeship program that the company offers? Is it by how many light bulbs are replaced with LED fixtures that use less electricity? This can be very flexible, and it's important not to get hung up on thinking about that and the complexity that some people do, because we can have reasonable, doable, impact-related measurements that we can create pretty quickly and yet still provide those deliverables. As far as the donor advised fund is concerned, because we don't have the same legal restrictions as private foundations, we can be a lot more broad with how we define that. What we're really trying to do is make sure that we can, one, report that the world is better because of how the investments are being made. And
I don't know where our echo came from all of a sudden.
yeah.
I think it may have been the person who just joined.
Okay, but we can be very flexible. And the other thing that we're trying to do is make sure that the investment's not going to qualify as unrelated business income. So all we need to do is make sure that it connects to making the world better. One thing that my group does is every time we add an investment or add a program or add a mission, we review what we're reporting on our tax return to the IRS in terms of what our mission is. And we update that 1 year ahead on our tax return of when the investments are made, so that we're very aggressive about making sure that we're broadly defined in terms of what we can invest in.
Right. So one of the things that we know, if we're trying to follow Deming and manage things, that we need to measure what we're planning to manage. And so we're trying to convince startups to have an impact metric of some kind that they report on, like they do with their accounting in some way. And I put in one of the sustainability metrics organizations into the chat, but get some kind of data on a quarterly basis from the startup about what their progress looks like in terms of whatever we're measuring for the impact, and make that go. And so that would be helpful for you to make the process simpler if they just had a report that you just plugged in and you were done, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure to whom you were
I was
addressing.
thinking Melodie is the one that has to write the check. So if I give you, the company's reporting on metrics, then it simplifies the task of validating.
Yeah. And again, we usually try to address that ahead of time. So we'll come up with what's reasonable to expect. These startups are already overwhelmed with trying to run a business. So we're not trying to add a burdensome reporting piece to them. We want to find something that they're already tracking, or they should be tracking to be successful, and then correlate it with these impact metrics. And honestly, the SDGs from the UN, those are probably the most easy to use and globally accepted. So that's a report that looks good for everyone.
So I'm spending time on this Northwest local food ecosystem call on a regular basis. So let's dive into that as sort of an example. Let's say that I've got a young enthusiast who believes that local food is the answer to everything, and they're not accredited, but they see all of these farms and distribution mechanisms and localities that are food deserts that they want to do something about. And they have a really effective social media reach. And so they decide to create a DAF, and they, are not accredited. So they put their $5,000 in and they set up the DAF, and then they go on a social media blitz and saying, we're going to fund a bunch of companies that are food companies that will fix our food system in the local area, and they raise some money. Is this all lining up with the possibilities for you, Melody?
Yeah, so how we'd work with that is at the beginning, we'd set up an account with them. It'd say, are we going to advertise as Legacy, which is my main group, or are we advertising under a different name? My group does a lot of white
I could set up the
so,
Northwest Food Ecosystem
yes,
Fund. And
something that relates to that cause. And then what we normally ask is, please send the marketing materials by our office. We'll just review them briefly to make sure that they're compliant. That's a very fast thing, as long as we just get copied on stuff. And the compliance part that's important is that the funds raised needs to go to my company. So normally we're going to set up, well, we already have existing accounts with a lot of the payment options out there, but sometimes we're setting up new ones just for that. One thing that we do with PayPal, for example, is we do unique buttons so that the money comes in flagged what it's for. So what's important there in terms of regulation and compliance is that my group sends out the receipts and is the one that gets the money into our accounts. But again, as we're setting that up, when we set up the account, we're going to make sure that we can actually use the money for those startups. We're going to say, please give us the list of everybody you're looking at. Great, it looks good. Or can you tweak a few of these things? You know, we can structure it this way, but not that way. So we already have it in place for as funds come in to be able to make the investments. With my approach, I don't like raising money and then saying no. So we're going to look at that at the same time as we set up the account.
So I raise money. Is there sort of a minimum check going out that's important to think about in terms of check size that I'm going to be writing the checks for, or can I write $100 checks to lots of farmers?
Yeah, so my group does not have account minimums, and we don't have grant minimums. As far as investment goes, you know, if we're doing private equity, that's a lot more difficult to track. There's a lot more compliance. So we usually try to aim for at least 50,000. Now, 50,000 in one company doesn't have to come from one fund or one donor. We can have any number of people participating in what makes up that amount. If we're doing debt, it's a lot easier to do some smaller amounts. So we'll do a working capital revolving credit line or note, because that's quick and easy if we're dealing with smaller amounts.
John, I think it's important to note on that specific point, and Melody noted this earlier. First of all, when you just think of the overall concept of for-profit impact investing out of your donor advised fund, just that by itself has shrunk the world of donor advised sponsors into a handful that will even today permit that kind of activity for a variety of reasons. There's the groups that would like to hold on to the money. There's the groups that would like, if that money's going to go, we only want it to go to our one donated group. I mean, there's a variety. We don't need to go down that, but there are just not many DAF sponsor organizations today that permit that. We advise to different DAF sponsors to help them see the light, but the reality is it's a very small number. Within that number, the numbers get really small as it relates to who will allow small dollar investments. So there are, of the handful out there that are allowing for-profit investment, almost all of them are at least $100,000 minimums, if not $200,000 to $250,000 minimums. And so that's fine. If you're in the $1 million investment club, these may be good options, and we work with groups that like those options, and we'll help advise them around that. But if you're in the $100,000 or less, $50,000 investment world, the types of things that Legacy and Melody provide are, I hate to use the word unique, but certainly special within this environment.
Right. So this is possible through a bunch of different DAF administrators. However, DAF administrators come in all shapes and sizes, and there are very few that work at this level for doing the kind of thing I just described. I know that the Seattle Impact Investors Group spent a significant amount of energy on trying to get the Seattle Foundation to enable this kind of thing, but they got kind of grumpy about it and didn't do very well with that process. And so We know that there's some overhead to this process. What's the costs that are going to be involved in doing this? So I raised my $100,000 to go to that farm down the street. So what? What do I have to pay besides that?
Yeah, well, this is aside from investment management fees or whatever the fund itself is charging. But in terms of my platform offering, any of the services that we provide are charged on 100 basis points annually, taken at the end of a period. So that equates to 1% or annually. Now, when and how we take that depends on the asset type and how it's being leveraged. My group tries to take a very long-term approach. We view these accounts as ones that we want to help grow and foster, more so than immediate needs to make a lot of money. There's some nuances in there, but it equates to 1% flat.
Cool. So I'm back to this person that's doing their local farm raising thing. They don't know which companies they're planning to go into when they raise the money. They're just going to solve the systemic problem. So they can't give you a list of companies ahead of time. Maybe they run an event or they run a process by which they do the research to find people. They then go and like any good investment, they do due diligence on that to see if it's a real business and do the financial modeling like we do in the Seattle Angel Conference, where we make sure that the team and the project and the finances all stand on their own two legs and are going somewhere. And now they've selected one. We want to invest in this one. What do they do next to get the check to them?
Yeah. So hopefully, as they've been doing that due diligence, they're just copying my office on that. We would step in really early on if we saw a problem, so that by the time they've said, this is the one we want to do, again, as long as we're copied, we'll stay silent and out of it unless there's something that looks problematic. But then, hey, this is the one. And before they pick that, I would assume that we've already sat down and said, here's what the terms need to look like. So here's what the criteria for selecting who the investee will be. So as long as it matches that pre-approved criteria, then they let us know their decision. They send over the due diligence that supports that, and we write a check.
So talk to me a little bit about the terms, right? I can invest in public stocks. I can invest in private stocks. I can invest in convertible notes. I can invest in safes. I can invest in revenue loans. I can invest in term loans.
Let me put it this way. My company owns 3 elephants in Thailand. We invest in everything. Okay. And if you've ever tried to figure out what the accounting is when an elephant has a baby and your asset doubles, any of those vehicles we can and do invest in and through. As far as terms go, it's going to be normal investment terms. What we would add is, here's what SDGs line up with why we're making this. Here's the social or impact purpose behind it. Add that into the term sheet, you're good.
Okay, cool. So this seems like it opens up a bunch of different doors for different audiences, right? It opens up the door for an angel investor to take their angel investing motion and apply it to their philanthropy. It opens up the door for a non-accredited person to pretend to be an angel investor and to build those muscles and maybe not financially benefit, but certainly impact-wise benefit, be significant in that place, and perhaps gives them even more flexibility to engage in that than the angel investors would be doing on their own.
Yeah,
and it also opens up the door for nonprofits to move from the traditional model of holding their core into actually being more impactful with their main corpus. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that changed this year was they changed the requirements to be a qualified investor, and it leans more heavily on experience. So the experience can come from working with your donor advised fund in terms of placing these investments. Even if you don't have the financial return, it can get somebody to qualify as a qualified investor quicker. One of the other uses that we often see is parents will give their children or their grandchildren discretion over the investments or the grants from a portion of the family donor advised fund. And it's how they're using it to train them to make wise financial decisions, because they don't have an absolute veto. They get to work with my team, and we often are sitting down and saying, here's why this looks good. Here's why this looks bad. Can we figure out a way to make it to meet what you're trying to do in a way that will also have good financial returns or make sense? So I see more and more families using it as a training tool to learn investing, because the money's already been put away. That's their only option. They're not able to go blow it on a Porsche.
And John, we talk a lot about that point. This is one of the things that Melody and I align on quite well. We are big advocates of donor advised funds as impact investing training grounds for older children, young adults, where their parents or grandparents have access to donated funds, and they want to be an angel investor, or they want to teach their children or grandchildren how to be angel investors. There's not a better path, because remember, these are zero risk funds. The expected return from a donor is negative 100%. It's not coming back. But for the companies that receive investment from DAFs, that's real money. That has real, you've made a choice. Somebody got the money, somebody didn't. The benefits to that company are real. The returns are real. How you measure that and track, both on the financial side and on the impact side, are real. So those are great ways to begin to learn the investing world. It just happens to be limited to impact investing.
And I would add in there, one of the other great uses of these tools is the fact that we don't have the same limits as far as how these assets are taxed that you would personally. So if an investor has an appreciated asset, they can gift the asset to the DAF before the liquidation event. The DAF doesn't pay cap gains tax, and then we can roll it into something else. And every time there's a liquidation, we're still not having to pay capital gains tax. So there's a greater means of appreciating the value long-term in these assets. And we can also help, we can also gain access to assets that investors are sitting on because they don't know what to do about the tax hit.
So did you just tell me that I can take all of my angel investments that are mediocre, that I don't want to deal with anymore, and roll them into a DAF, and then whatever happens, and
yep, and you get a deduction for that, so you can liquidate some of the pieces you want to keep. Most people don't give me cash.
Oh, that's good. That's good. All right. I see that Devin has his hand.
And John, just one more quick thing. You were talking about the different groups that can benefit. The one that I'm not sure you had, which is I think just a baseline case, is like what Devin said, which is, here's a way to you're already making investments, impact or otherwise. Here's just another pool of capital you can unlock to do more. Whether you're the donor, the investor yourself, or you're the RIA or wealth manager who keeps hearing from their client, hey, I want to do more. Here's a pool of funds that you can access and immediately start doing something beneficial. Itch that impact scratch that your client may have. Scratch that impact itch, I guess, that your client may have, and begin to do some good through that mechanism as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. Devin, you have a question?
Yeah. So something that really resonated with me was the statement about potentially having your kids learn, how to invest wisely through this process. And I have a question around whether, so is there any limit on what you can do in terms of, so we've talked about kind of all the unique things we can do and the benefits of this that are different from other options out there. What I'm wondering specifically is if a family member has, let's say, decided to donate or transfer to my kids some stocks for a company that, let's say, that we still believe is an impact, company, something like a hydrogen company. Is that something that can coexist inside of this, or is that something that has to be liquidated and then invested in something else? Because this is like a public company I'm talking about.
Melody?
Yeah, so on that, we can hold assets of any type, including that type of asset. The question regarding whether or not it needs to be liquidated would largely be a factor of timing for the family. Now, if we're trying to have more impact, publicly held securities are not going to be the favorite vehicle, but there are times where that's a good place to hold. If you're talking about donating, there's a difference between donating closely held securities and investing in closely held securities. So if you're talking about the family company, you can make a donation of closely held stock in the family company, but we're not going to be investing in the family company from a donor advised fund.
Okay, so yeah, this example is kind of very much a one family member who believes, you know, hydrogen is going to eventually make the world a better place, and therefore investing in public hydrogen companies and wanting to, you know, kind of give that to potentially grandchildren, you know, and so wanting to keep that, I think, desire alive, but yet, you know, also use it as a vehicle to help the kids learn. And I guess the alternative, or the one thing I knew was a possibility before today, was putting it in a UTMA account for them, or like a, I guess, a 529. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
One that I would suggest with that particular scenario would be to consider doing a CRT, where the family continues to have some, well, access to the income, but the investments can be structured along the goals of the original family member or client. And that would be a hybrid vehicle. But again, there's a lot more details in what the family's goals are. Are they trying to make sure that the family doesn't change the investment structure because of their belief in hydrogen? Are they trying to provide for the family? Are they trying to deal with a tax issue? Depending on a lot of those questions, it would change what vehicle would be best to structure that in.
Okay.
And 529s are great, but there's a limit to how much you want to put in one of those. There's some significant limits on the use.
Right. Okay.
So we have a question from Monica that's asking about the payback of the investment. She wonders about how that process looks like to pay back the investment that was made.
Yeah. I mean, Melody, you can, if there's more minutia here, but in general, I mean, the idea here is to use these funds no differently than other investors. So, you know, let's say a company's out there and it's taking on, you know, a minimum investment of $50,000. It's raising 200,000, and 150 of that comes from 3 different investors out of their own portfolio, and another comes from an investor out of their donor advised fund. They all should line up. Like there doesn't need to be anything special about the requirements of that donor advised fund and how it's structured or the returns or otherwise. It should line up clearly. Now you can do that. You can add complication. You can create different kinds of class structures and all that. But in the most simple way, there's nothing about, oh, I'm investing for a DAF, therefore I need a different kind of return structure. That's not the idea.
Correct. It can be the same. You just send funds the way you'd send it to any other investor using the same terms, the same time frame.
But it
now,
is
what
important.
You wouldn't do is send the money back to the donor.
Right. So it's very important that the name on the ownership is to the DAF, not to the owner, so that the money gets written back to the fund, not back to.
There won't be any question about that because the money comes from the donor advised fund. It has to be returned to the donor advised fund. The donor is advising that that's where they'd like that money to go, but ultimately the money belongs to Legacy or whoever the donor advised fund sponsor is that's orchestrating that. That's how you've obtained those tax benefits to begin with, is you no longer have ownership over those funds.
Yeah, and typically we provide wire and ACH instructions when you sign the documents. So those are already on file.
So if you invest in a startup and you write a convertible note, and then they have another round of funding and that converts to equity, and then 10 years later that equity then turns into an IPO or turns into a merger, at that transaction point, a check comes back, or more likely multiple checks come back spread out over a couple of years as they figure out how that merger actually was supposed to work. And then that gets written back to the fund. And if you did a revenue redemption where you had quarterly payments, then quarterly payments would come into the fund and then they would account for it and away we go. So I see a note from Dana asking, can impact investing and charitable donations coexist in the same DAF? And I think the way I understand it, just to put a broad thing on it, is you can have any number of deals that you want inside a DAF with any deal terms you want on a per deal basis, all the way from grant on one side to public equity on the other side and everything in between. Yes?
Yeah, we can do both. We can do all of that. You know, the best scenario is having the assets invested for impact and the returns or gains, using that to grant out as the family needs. A lot of the families I work with say, we're going to invest the bulk, but here's our budget that we discuss as a family every year for what we're granting out of the same account.
So I take and I build a corpus of $500,000, and then I invest that however I'm going to invest that. And then I take 4% and I say, I'm going to use the magic 4% rule, and we're going to donate that away each year in some way, right? Or whatever rule we choose, right? We can use the Bill Gates, it'll be gone before I'm dead kind of thing as well, right? Dana, do you want to dive into that anymore?
No, that was great. I mean, so in my brain, I'm maybe equating it a little bit into like an endowment, in that you can have investments growing with impact investing, and then at the same time decide like this is just a straight donation or a grant of that. Okay, thank you. No, that's super helpful.
But with far greater flexibility. So that's sometimes why foundations are set up, and they're done perhaps particularly private foundations too rapidly as a, hey, I want to do a few different things. So, oh, well, you have to do that by a foundation. And then they suddenly realize all the challenges that come with running and managing a foundation and how to get funds out of a foundation. Donor advised funds are the quick and easy path to say, oh, okay, I got $100,000. I'd like to invest 50 of that. I'd like to donate 25. I'd like to keep 25 because I think maybe something 3 years from now is something I want to put some money in. Like all of that flexibility is right there, right from the beginning, yet you get the few immediate $100,000 write-off in that example.
Yeah, and I want to comment in the Caitlin post about training wheels and spreading that risk. Yes, that's absolutely the best approach for these smaller accounts for people starting out. We want to hedge it by investing in 10 different companies instead of focusing on one for a lot of these groups.
And so the notion that we were talking about in terms of investment size is what's the right size check operationally to come out of your program. But the checks that we need to write to startups, there's a size that the startup wants to get, and we need to sort of be in that space. So we probably are not writing lots of impact investments in private companies at $5,000 a piece. We're probably writing them at $50,000 a piece, and we're probably raising a fund that's multiples of that. And in my worldview, angel investing requires at least 20 deals. So if I'm going to make my DAF be functional, then I need to be doing at least 20, maybe 40 deals in that DAF for that DAF to have the chance to do what Rick said of there was a big one in there that did something miraculous. Yeah. So yeah. I'm seeing Greg ask a question about this 4% rule.
Well, I'm just going to comment that fees are different than grants. So if you're thinking about a DAF, part of what should be included on top of fees would be the fact that hopefully we're not just investing, but we're granting out money. So we are spending down at that rate. So it's easy to still use that 4% rule in terms of how you approach the investing structure, because, and that's not money going to the costs of it, but it is money that should be going out to some degree. I think there will always be a place for grants along with the investing side.
And the grants don't have the same complexity. And so writing
Correct.
small grants is useful. So one of the problems that I have from the angel point of view is we would like to find those very, very early founders where a 5K or 10K check would fundamentally change their path into being a startup. But we can never raise that money in an investment tool where the cost of raising that money isn't more than the deployment of it. So
Yeah.
really, we can't invest in a company at 10K, but we could grant to a company 10K and it would work just fine.
Correct. And I will say that while I mentioned a $50,000 general limit for equity, something that we do with a lot of those 5 or 10K groups is we'll do a convertible note. That's really easy for us to do. Frankly, my team will do the note if we just get the information. So we don't have outside legal fees. Now we have a note. The biggest issue is now we have an asset that we have to track on our books every year. So will the founder give us financial statements so we can show what's happening? But we'll usually structure that as convertible debt. So much easier to track, much easier to pass due diligence, that might be converted to a grant if the company doesn't work.
Right. Right. And so for the problems that I have, we have underrepresented groups that we would like writing more angel checks. And a lot of times they're hesitant to come into the angel investing space. So we've started a sponsoring program where some of our alumni angels buy the unit, but then they give the discretion to decide which company and vote and go through the program to someone who's been selected. What I just heard you say is that we could help people raise funds in a DAF, which would then be invested through our program, and they could essentially self-sponsor themselves by engaging in that fundraising from friends and family of that $5,000. Is that true?
Yeah. No, for us, we wouldn't do that in a DAF, do that in a program fund. All of a sudden I'm getting feedback, but yes, it functionally can work like that.
Cool. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask questions. So are there any questions that people have? John, you have any questions?
John, I have a clarification on the question you guys answered around limits.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about being able to do a convertible note as a smaller option, and the example you just gave of underrepresented founders is exactly where I'm looking at this DAF role. And so when we talk about, we're saying, okay, equity needs to be a minimum of 50K. We can do a convertible note at that 5 or 10K that we convert to a grant. What is, like, I'd like a little more clarity here on those smaller sizes, because when we think about a convertible note, we're thinking about that's going to convert to equity at the next round, or it's not going to get to a next round and it's going to be a loss within the portfolio.
Yeah, let me clarify. It converts to a grant if it ends up being a loss. So that's something that happens on my side. So it would operate just as it normally does if it's a for-profit investor writing that $5,000 or $10,000 check. And hopefully if the company's successful, it converts to equity in the next round as the valuation goes up. If a next round does not happen, if the company folds, then on my books, we convert it as if we made it a grant in the first place.
It's how they do.
How we write off the loss.
Okay, that's just how you're handling the loss. So that's not going to be, so you're just treating every grant as a loss basically against the portfolio.
In essence, yes, because
Okay.
that's money that never comes back. But
okay.
It's good to do that.
Sure. Is there the same, so you talk about program funds versus DAFs. Are DAFs allow for that charitable write-off to the person who contributed at the beginning? I'm assuming program funds don't give that option?
Oh, no, they do. They
Okay.
do. Actually, the deductibility of donations to program funds are better than DAFs. That's part of why this year my group has seen a spike in that, because under the CARES Act, just for 2020, donations to DAFs are limited up to 60% of adjusted gross income. Donations to a program fund can be applied up to 100% of adjusted gross income.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and that's where we've seen some people that have been more interested in some of those, depending on how 2020 went, right? Some people, 2020 has been a great year, and so trying to figure out how to do some of that. But so the difference is that a program fund essentially is like what you'd see as a program fund with a nonprofit, where, hey, this was our mutual understanding of what we were doing this for, but from a legal standpoint, there's no official advisor capacity, and so that changes the charitable structure.
yeah, and
Okay.
the program fund is similar to just, this is a program the charity's sponsoring. So donations to that qualify for donations to the general fund of a public charity, which is why the deductibility is so much better than a DAF.
Mhm. What about the expenses associated with due diligence? Do those, I mean, typically when we think of a standard fund and you've got, you know, you're banking into that in the management fee structure. In a DAF, you know, you talked about the 1% management fee on your side. Would we have to have the funds for the management for the due diligence separate from the DAF, or how does that part work?
Yeah, it depends. Now, if we can keep the due diligence to a minimum, if we're just drafting a simple note, those are included in the 1%. Frankly, part of why we do that is because part of what my board sees our personal charitable mission to be is to support this kind of investment and work. So
I think she was thinking about spending money to do the due diligence on her side.
but if we're spending money, that would be a third-party expense that can be paid by the DAF or from the fund. But that would be in addition to if we're working with third-party due diligence providers.
But let's suppose that she wanted to create a fund that was, you know, white labeled kind of fund that you donate to as her fundraising mechanism. And she wanted to take a 2 and 20 management fee on that. Would she set that up as a DAF? Because she's paying herself out of that. Or
Yeah.
would you set that up as a program fund? Or is this just a crazy notion?
DAFs can't hire people, program funds can.
But to the point that was being made prior, you can engage third parties, and I know because we do this work at LOHAS, to provide those advisory services around impact investing. So it could be due diligence, deal sourcing, any number of those things. And to Melodie's point, we get paid if it's going to be an investment made out of their donor advised fund. Our services get paid out of the donor advised fund funds, so that, you know, it's not like we're now reaching into your pocket again. It's another mechanism where donated funds can be used to accomplish your goals around impact investing. Whereas if it was coming straight out of your portfolio and you were engaging a third party to do due diligence or sourcing or other things, or tracking and reporting, which we also do, for that you're paying us directly out of your, you know, your own pocketbook, not the donated fund, not the DAF pocketbook.
Yeah, and my question was more what John was clarifying, which is beyond whatever expenses there are associated with either of you, there's a lot of expense that goes into whether it's going on site to due diligence, whether it's hiring external consultants, or even just the actual expenses of travel or tests that need to be done or whatever. There's all of those things that go along during that process before making a decision to invest. And so I'm just trying to figure out, if we were to use the DAF as that kind of alternative to an investment fund structure, where that part would fit.
Yeah, now my team is going to be doing the compliance and the accounting and the registrations and all of that sort of thing. But the due diligence process can be very expensive with these opportunities. That would be an additional expense. And so that would be, you know, at whatever the agreement is. With some groups, we have a flat fee arrangement. With other groups, we pay the outright expenses. It really depends on the partnership arrangement.
But if you're a casual investor instead of a serious one like Caitlin, you might choose the higher Rick's company. You know, you filter it down to a group of people that you think are interesting, and you say, which of these are really investable, and you let him go do it, and you take the funds that he would spend to go figure that out of the DAF, and that all just falls into place without any special paperwork, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
You don't have to be a registered charity. That can be a business expense of running the DAF.
Yeah, I'm a registered charity, but we can have expenses and we can hire third-party contractors to provide some of those services. Sometimes we do things in-house. Sometimes we're working with these outside service providers, depending on the donor's requests, the needs of the particular investment vehicle, and the partnership arrangement.
Okay.
Cool. Are there other questions that people have? Francois, did you learn anything about setting up funds in this weird way?
Yeah, a little bit. Still absorbing the stuff. I'm entirely new to DAF, so I was really here to get like a primer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and if you have a healthcare bias, healthcare is one of the SDGs, and so you can actually build this thing up. So one of the questions I have is, you know, on one hand we have Reg D, and then we have Reg CF, which WeFunder sort of straddles those two with their crowdfunding platform, and then we have the DAF. So we can set up 3 different pathways for investment into a company, where we're taking either philanthropic money, or we're taking public money, or we're taking accredited money. Is that a relationship that you've ever thought about, Melodie, of having WeFunder as a partner, and you just click the button and say, this is a donation on their website instead of
Yeah.
this is an...
We often do that. Most of the groups we work with have separate websites. We have donation buttons that can go on there that send the money to us, but it looks like it's going to them. It's under their white label. We often work with other DAF providers in terms of facilitating structuring these investments. So we can have, if you have a Fidelity DAF, they can move the money to me because I'm a qualified charity, and then we can do stuff with it. But yeah, most of the groups I work with in terms of partnership or feeder relationships of that nature have their own websites. We just make sure that the payment options go to me, and we review what's on there. You know, are they advertising in a way that's compliant or not?
Right.
Yeah, John, and I would add that, you know, those structures are, you're not limited to, say, equity out of the DAF, as I think Melodie talked about earlier, that she talked about convertible notes, but you could do lending out of a DAF. You can be a guarantor out of a DAF, which is very meaningful often within the social impact realm, to enable, you know, outside investment. So, you know, there are a variety of mechanisms there that your donor advised funds could be used for that, you know, don't necessarily mirror the traditional Reg D type structure.
Yeah, frankly, a lot of funds that I work with, what they do is they ask for a letter of intent to invest, which is a great way of going around and saying, hey, we have a group that's willing to invest in us. Why don't you invest as well? And sometimes we actually end up raising the money and making that investment. Sometimes we don't. But for a lot of groups, it helps having some documented support that there's a vehicle, that there's interest, that there's investment activity that can come in.
We have a CDFI that I'm, I guess, working with called Business Impact Northwest, who's specifically looking for that guarantor role. They would like angel investors or someone to put money into a CD to sit as the collateral against loans for these small businesses that are not able to raise the amount of cash they need because of the debt payment structure inside their businesses. So that would be a very useful way to do that. And what I just heard you say is that we could set up a nonprofit through a DAF, essentially set up a DAF and then create a fund that just did that, right? Bought CDs and then pledged them against the CDFI.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I see Sophie asking a question about how does someone with global environmental impact vision find angel investors? The short answer to that is E8 Angels is in town, and they do all of that kind of work, and they're national. And Seattle Angel Conference is an organization that connects angel investors to those kinds of individuals. So you're here. So that one I can answer quickly. Johnson, do you have any questions or thoughts?
No, it's pretty clear. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Elaine, how about you? Ready to set up a DAF?
Team, it's great. This is my first kind of in-depth dive into DAF, so it's great to understand. And John, I think what I kind of took away from what you said, it was almost that last thing was the 3 different pathways for investments: philanthropic, accredited, and public money, and how somebody in a broad portfolio or in a company might be able to take advantage of investing in those 3 ways. So I love thinking about it that way.
Well,
So
and I would add, John, just real quick on that point, because I'm familiar with Elaine's company, Kachinga, that she mentioned. It's a great example. I mean, this is a company focused on financial literacy, an ideal candidate for investment out of a donor advised fund, you know, doing things well positioned for good financial returns, but also clearly with an underlying social purpose. You know, these are the exact types of organizations that should be soliciting investment from donor advised funds, but also where donors who have set aside money or are contemplating setting aside money into a donor advised fund into which they should be investing. I mean, this is the poster child for a DAF for-profit impact investment.
Right, and there was a program. There's a company in Seattle named Green Canopy Homes, and Green Canopy Homes basically buys a house, retrofits it for environmental stuff, right? Puts insulation in, blah blah blah, and then flips the house and sells it. And they raise money for the company, but then they set up this loan fund that they use to buy the houses with. And they found that they could get a certain amount of angel dollars from people, but they got a substantially larger amount of angel dollars from the same people into the loan fund, because for them it was a separate asset class. And so even though you've raised angel money from someone, doesn't mean that you can't get philanthropic money from that same person, or the other way around. Even though you attract someone with philanthropic money, doesn't mean that they might then learn enough that they're willing to do angel money. And those asset class differences make a difference.
Well,
Yeah.
well, Melodie, can you comment on that for a second? Because there is a nuance there that is important.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to get the nuance you're referencing, but I was going to comment and say one example of something that I've recently done on that is we're working with a company that has an online educational offering. They've been very successful at raising on their end, but what we're doing on the nonprofit side is a bond offering that will subsidize students being able to attend the university. This is a win for the university. They've guaranteed having a good student pipeline, and it's a win for the investors on the nonprofit side because they see a bond. It's secured by the university. It's a different way of raising capital, and that hybrid structure using different asset classes on either the for-profit or the nonprofit side can be a really powerful tool, not just to raise capital, but to create product flow.
And what I was simply referring to is, you know, are you permitting a party who has invested in a company to then take their DAF money and invest in the same company?
And yes, the answer to that is it depends. So it depends on whether or not there's control or significant ownership in that company. If there is, we can't do it in a DAF, we can do it in a program fund. Now, if the investor if there's co-investing in the same privately held company and the donor of the donor advised fund is not holding a significant amount of equity, the calculation for that varies, and they're not running it themselves, their son isn't working for the company, then that's easy to do. So we do a lot of co-investing, but there's some parameters to make sure that the donors aren't getting an extra kickback.
And that was the nuance I wanted you to highlight. Yes,
Yeah.
that part exactly.
So if I'm not owning more than 10% of the company individually, I can.
Yeah, under
right?
10%, we're really safe.
Not to turn the conversation political, but this is the problem, or one of the many problems our current president got into with his own university structure, where he was both investing in and donating to, and writing off those donations to the
yes
that he owned. So you have to yeah, you have to be smarter than the president when making these sorts of investments.
I will refrain from commenting. Catherine, do you have any questions? Not hearing anything. How about you, Andrew?
I'm good. This has been excellent. I've already learned more than my brain can handle. Thank you very much.
All right, fair enough. Monica, any remaining questions? Not hearing anything. You went off mute, but not hearing anything.
Hey, John.
Yes, Devin.
Hey, sorry, didn't hear who you said before Monica, so if it was me, I apologize. But I do have a question. Because I apologize as well if this is dumb, because like my brain is kind of spinning about all the possibilities right now with all this information. But I think very specifically the one that I had was, let's say that my wife wants to start a nonprofit, and rather than me let's say just giving her money to help, or donating the money directly to the nonprofit, I'm kind of trying to see the benefits of potentially doing that through a DAF. And I'm seeing some of them maybe be because you could do some kind of crowdfunding a little more easily, or at least with the way that Melodie's got things set up, through the different buttons on PayPal. You can obviously get a lot of help with the legal and compliance aspects and stuff. Are there other benefits that I should be considering as well?
Yeah, so there's a lot of benefits there, but here's one thing that we often do. Our program funds grew out, how we treat those, they grew out of a fiscal sponsorship program that worked as a charity incubator. We meet a lot of people who are very philanthropically minded and don't realize that it's going to cost somewhere between $5,000 to $20,000 just for the initial paperwork with a CPA or lawyer to set up most nonprofits. We can set up a program fund much cheaper than that. We don't charge to set them up. And we've had quite a few of our program funds, as they've gained more activity or business, spin off into nonprofits in their own right. So one thing we often do is help incubate or foster doing the back end admin and compliance side. One of the benefits is it costs money to solicit as a charity in the US. Every state has different rules. And if you have a website, there are some states that assume you're soliciting in that state, even if your offices are not there and you don't have donors there. And while most small nonprofits are not going to get hit for that, it does occasionally happen. So that would be some of the benefits. And for some people, our little program fund incubator works really well. For others, they still want their own setup. But I've worked with a lot of groups who, frankly, most of them still use my offices for the back end accounting, but they've grown from being a fund to being a nonprofit in their own right.
So the process of setting up a nonprofit, which has
501c3 status.
Status, so that it's tax deductible. Actually, it's not as quick and easy as you might think. It's not like setting up an LLC. And so you're supposed to pretend that you're tax deductible. You set up this entity, and then you work on it for a year or two. And so putting a DAF up and raising money through that provides you with some flexibility to take money that's tax deductible and be compliant regardless of how your entity works for a while. And you can do things with it which would then suit your purpose, especially the granting part of it, without having all of that IRS brouhaha that takes a lot of brain power at the board level, that you don't really want to have that conversation.
Yeah, when you set up initially, even if you've applied to the IRS for nonprofit status, if they reject it, it can reverse the tax deductibility of donations. So there's a higher risk there, and fewer donors or foundations that are sophisticated enough to understand that nuance are willing to support startup charities until they have guaranteed verification, and that's usually on average about an 18-month process.
If you do it well.
Yes, if you do it well. I once had 3 months, but most people take over 18.
Yes. Monica, do you have any questions?
Thank you, John. I fixed my, I think I fixed my microphone issue. I feel a little bit like Andrew. I technically have probably a lot of questions. I'm looking at this topic from various angles, both as a potential investor as well as for an organization that is looking to receive investments. But this is my first dipping my toes into this topic. So I took down all the information that you've shared, your contact information, and this was like extremely valuable as a first starting point for me. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So picking up on the clue from Monica around foreign entities, you know, if I'm thinking about investing in Africa instead of investing in the Northwest Local Food System, is there any complications that come up by selecting Nigerian princes to invest in?
Well, if it's a Nigerian prince, we're probably going to have a conversation about the risks involved with that and help the client see the light that that's not
you need
why.
to pay us some of those due diligence fees before you make those investments. Yeah.
So we have a group in town called Fledge, which is an accelerator, an impact accelerator that has, by preference of the founder, an African bias. And he tends to be investing in African companies. About 6 out of every 8 companies are African. And we've actually invested in some Tanzanian and Ugandan companies.
We can and do invest in foreign companies. My platform, we invest in Africa. I just did an investment in Bolivia. We do invest in foreign entities.
And in addition, those are great candidates for the program structure that Melodie's talked about, where you're saying, I really care about the Caribbean and the devastation, and I'd really like to create a resiliency fund focused on the Caribbean. Using a donor advised fund or a program structure in the way that Melodie's described to invest in and then have that fund managed by parties like LOHAS or others that could come in and allocate those funds into very clear parameters set up by the DAF set up on the front end. Those are tremendous mechanisms for doing good.
Cool. Any last words, Rick or Melodie, since everybody else seems to have had their questions answered?
Melodie?
I'll just, both Rick and I, our contact info is in the chat. Feel free to reach out with questions. At the end of the day, you know, just personally, I'm obviously a big fan of philanthropy, but I'm a big fan of doing philanthropy in a regenerative way. And that means investing in companies that are doing good and investing in nonprofits far more than just writing a check that will soon be spent and will limit future good that we can do. So, you know, I think that the issues with philanthropy are far more in terms of how can we liberate capital where it's already been donated or will be donated in a manner that will move these companies forward. And we can do that while still making great returns, learning good lessons about investing, and working with the families and the companies that we're dealing with. So that's
cool.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I could have said it any better, John. I think we want to, as an organization, as a firm, unlock capital to go into meaningful social enterprises and projects and funds and things of that nature. Donor advised funds are just one of those mechanisms that could be used that are terribly underutilized within this capacity. And so if that's something that we can, move the needle just a little bit, there's the opportunity to have a really big impact. And in very much the way that Melodie talked about, these are sustainable investing models that we're supporting here that should deliver returns and be able to be reinvested in the future. And let's be clear, if any of us have any money to invest, it's because we earned it through a model that allowed us someone invested in us or the organizations we worked with. We generated returns, and therefore there were returns to be reinvested. This is more of the same with a social or environmental focus.
Cool. That sounds wonderful. I really appreciate all the time and everybody coming and doing this. This was very timely for me, and I hope that we can do more with this as we go forward. It strikes me, I'm working with Looney Libs at Pledge around this notion of an angel accelerator to train angels at the sort of next level above what the Angel Conference does to fund impact investment or impact accelerators around the world. So we're trying to build that. So it makes sense to me that we could just use a DAF as a mechanism to fund that whole organization and make that go. And so now my wheels are also spinning in this place. For those of you in the audience that are angel investors but haven't gotten to your 20 investments yet, the Angel Conference is a path where I try and help people learn how to do that in a learning by doing point of view. Our main event is November 18th for this round. So go to our website and sign up if you want to attend. We will start workshops again focused on that investment process in January. And all of you got here because you got on the Seattle Angel meetup group. And so that's where we announce all of our workshops. And I'm also available for office hours or open coffee or whatever people want to talk about startups and funding startups. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having us, John. Enjoyed it.
That was great. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very, very insightful.
Thank you, team.
Thank you.
No, we should
Thank
write
you.
an article about this angel investing through DApps. We need to sort of do a case study, I think.
I think that's a great idea, John. Let's have that offline discussion at some point.
Yeah, let's do that. All right. Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
week. Thank you all.